Hello, I'm Sarah Foot. I'm the Professor of Church History in Oxford, and I'm delighted to welcome you back this afternoon after some fascinating discussions this morning. We're going to go now to a very different time and place. We're going to think about Northumbria in the early Middle Ages, and we're going to think about the person and the cult of St. Cuthbert, who died on the island of Farne in the year 687. I'm delighted to welcome Katharine Tiernan to talk to us about the trilogy of novels that she's written about St. Cuthbert. Cuthbert of Farne, Place of Repose, A New Heaven and a New Earth, all of them published by Sacristy Press. Katharine, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah.
As a saint, Cuthbert's very well known. We've got lots of contemporary accounts of his life and a number of narratives and hagiographies written by the community of Durham that had charge of him from the early 11th century onwards. Lots of people feel quite strongly about Cuthbert, and I think you particularly feel that he's somebody about whom you've been interested and about whom you've cared all the way back to your childhood. Is that right?
Yes, that's true, Sarah. I grew up in North Northumberland, and Cuthbert has always been a background presence. In the happy days before mass tourism, we used to go to Farne with a picnic, and I could see where St. Cuthbert's cell had been and the aqueduct that he'd taken care of. And I was in St. Cuthbert's house at school, and I went to St. Cuthbert's church. So I think St. Cuthbert's always been there.
Is St. Cuthbert very particularly a Northumbrian saint? How much do you think he's linked with the place and the wider region where he lived and ministered in life?
Well, there's a very strong connection with the landscape. From Lindisfarne down to Durham, has a very strong connection, and that connection's been there for 1400 years. So it is a strong presence. But he wasn't always just a Northumbrian saint. He appeared in a dream to King Alfred before the Battle of Ethandune, and the House of Wessex were very keen adherents of St. Cuthbert. So he did have countrywide fame.
Yeah, that's right. What was it that made you decide that you wanted to write about Cuthbert in fiction? Given that there's such a lot of surviving medieval material about him, I might have thought it would be difficult to imagine a person and put him on the printed page. What made you think that this would be a good subject for novels?
Well, I think my St. Cuthbert moment, if you like, came not in Northumberland after all, but in London. I was waiting to catch the 2 o'clock up to Berwick, and I had a couple of hours to kill. And I decided to visit the British Library, which is just up the road. And there was an exhibition on there of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And it was wonderful to see the Gospels, but my attention was really riveted by some other objects they had on display that had been taken from Cuthbert's coffin when it was opened in the 19th century. And they had the travelling altar that he'd used when he went on his evangelical journeys, and his pectoral cross, very beautiful gold and garnet cross. And they had his own copy of the St. John Gospel. And these objects really made an impression on me. It was as if suddenly the legend I'd grown up with became real in some way. It's as if he might just walk in the door and pick up his things. And I had a very strong sense of his presence and a very strong desire afterwards to write something about him. But as you say, that wasn't so easy. I went, as everyone who's interested in Cuthbert does, to Bede's Life of Cuthbert. It's wonderfully engaging, and definitely a must read. But for me, wanting to write about Cuthbert, it was quite daunting, quite discouraging in a way, because Bede had done it already. And what could you do? Retell the stories. What was the point? And I went ahead and wrote something else in the meantime. But a history of Northumbria came out by Nick Hyam, which dealt with the same period as when Cuthbert's life of Anglo-Saxon Northumbria. And reading Nick Hyam, I suddenly became aware of all the things that Bede hadn't told us. Bede is very discreet about the politics of the church. And it became clear that there was a lot more to tell about Cuthbert, and which explained in a way why, especially towards the end of his life, he had so much influence, which isn't really accounted for in Bede. And it seems to me that, if you like, Bede was the transcendence, and this was the immanence, the political, the religious side of Cuthbert's society. And putting Cuthbert into the context of that world was perhaps something that hadn't been done before, and hopefully brings out different things about his life.
It's fascinating the way you start the first novel by imagining a context in which the celebrated and conflict surrounded Bishop Wilfrid and Cuthbert might have encountered one another. So Bede is entirely silent, as are all our sources, on whether they did ever meet. But of course, there's no earthly reason why they might not have done. Did you find the Wilfrid-Cuthbert tension a valuable one to help you thinking in fictional terms?
Yeah, so just the background on Wilfrid for the audience. Wilfrid was a flamboyant and charismatic proponent of the Roman tradition, and very controversial. And a kind of breakthrough came for me when I realized they were born in the same year. They were exact contemporaries. It was also the year that Aidan brought Christianity to Northumbrian. So Christianity was very new, and yet already there were these tensions between the two different traditions. Wilfrid was very much a protagonist of the Roman tradition in rather a flamboyant continental way. And Cuthbert had grown up with the Celtic tradition, very ascetic tradition of Aidan. And we know that there were collisions between them. We know that Cuthbert was ejected with his companions from Ripon. And the person behind that ejection was Wilfrid. So there seemed to be good enough grounds to set up a tension between the two. And it's one of the conflicts of the novel, the attraction, repulsion between Cuthbert and Wilfrid. And it was a way of dramatizing that fault line between the Celtic and Roman traditions.
That's interesting. There's a question been asked by Paul in the chat about the fact that there have been a number of novels recently about 7th century Northumbria, fictionalising this period. There have been some books about Whitby and Hild, who's always a figure that attracts a lot of interest. What do you think is new that you were hoping to bring to the discussion?
I'm not sure that I was hoping to bring new particularly, but I think I was hoping to make Cuthbert's life immediate to a wider public. When you start reading about Cuthbert and reading about the period, there's really fascinating stuff, but it's very much in the academic realm. It's not out there for your interested layman. And I felt fiction is a good medium for bringing that about. I know it can be a medium for doing all sorts of other things. And I think something I was very keen to avoid was trying to make Cuthbert in any way ordinary or reduce his experience or significance. Anyway, yes.
So Cuthbert's life unfolds in different spheres. There's a real tension clearly in his own life between his personal desire, which is to spend as much time as he can in solitude and prayer and getting closer and closer to God, and the various calls that are put on him by the world, especially once he's called out of his hermitage on Farne to go and be a bishop. How much you talk in the novel about that inner and outer spaces that he occupies. When you were talking about him away from home, and his evangelizing work, particularly in the upland parts of Northumbria. How much did those physical objects, that tiny gospel book, the little portable altar, the petrol cross, how much did you imagine them as you situated him in those different contexts?
I guess that's a nice question. I guess they were kind of there. I mean, the evangelical part of his life is earlier in his monastic career. And perhaps the St. John Gospel, it's very, St. John Gospel was very important in the Celtic tradition. And I think it represents the mystical aspect of Cuthbert's spirituality. And I must admit, I find it very moving to think of him reading those words 1400 years ago. And the petrol cross perhaps represents the outward face, the having to become a bishop, essentially because he was the only person everyone could agree on at the time. So you actually have the King of Northumbria coming to beg him to be a bishop.
Yes, there's a scene in the book where you imagine him being vested in the paraphernalia of the episcopacy, with each separate garment and object that he's given, and you make him feel very uncomfortable as he takes them. Philip has asked in the chat whether you'd like to talk about some of the tensions that are surrounded with writing fiction about real people, especially when you're writing about a real flesh and blood person about whom we have so many historical sources.
Yes, I think the particular tension in this one, quite a lot of Cuthbert's life, I think, is open to imagining. For example, at the start of his life, we know that he was brought up in a warrior society. We know he fought in at least one campaign. And at the age of 17, for some reason, he chose to renounce that and to become a monk at a time when monasteries were a very, very new idea. And I think wondering why that might have happened and looking at the context for it, which was a campaign that had a very reprehensible outcome, even by the standards of the day, that Cuthbert would have been involved in. And I think there's a kind of legitimate place for fiction there to say, I wonder why he might have chosen to become a monk. But I was also very conscious in writing this that part of the task of a novelist is to empathise with the character. And as Cuthbert reaches the end of his life and becomes closer to sainthood, as a novelist, I stood back from his interior voice and let his actions speak for him.
Yes, that is very striking. The second work in your trilogy, am I right in thinking that that's actually the one that you wrote first?
Yes, it is. When I thought, I can't write about Cuthbert, I had the bright idea, well, if I can't write about Cuthbert, how about his community and what happened afterwards? Because there's Cuthbert definitely had an afterlife, and well, we still incredibly have his relics. Yeah.
So the second book takes us into the 9th century and the point when Viking raiding on the eastern coast of Northumbria made Lindisfarne just too dangerous a place to keep so precious a saint and the objects associated with him. So the community left Lindisfarne and set off wandering across Northumbria for an extended period of time, going to a variety of different places. They clearly contemplated going to Ireland. They got as far as the west coast. You situate them in Carlisle, and they spent a long period of time at Chester Street before they land up at Durham. I have to say, as an historian, I was really surprised when you told me that you wrote that one first, because I find those narratives incredibly confusing. It's very hard to work out anything approximating to a chronology that makes any sense. And precisely when Cuthbert got to Durham has recently been disputed. Did you find it a help or a hindrance that the sources are in some ways quite muddly?
Well, I think I kind of took a decision because I'm not an academic, and there are indeed many different versions of what happened and where they went. So they had this 7 years of on the road, as it were, with the coffee. And one of the earliest accounts was written by a monk of Durham, Simeon, who wrote a history of the Cuthbert community. And he was writing 200 years later after these events. And it's quite clear when you read Simeon's account that it's part of the folklore. You know, it's become the folklore of the community, these heroic adventures that they went on. And Cuthbert is very proactive in the story. He makes several direct interventions, sorting out the Danish king. And I found it just a really engaging narrative. And it is clear that it is sometimes historically inaccurate. Yes. But I decided to go with it, that I was going to go with Simeon's version, where there are gaps to use reasonable probability. And just hope for the best, that there was a poetic truth about the narrative, even if it wasn't absolutely nailed down historically. Because it's a story of it's a classic story, it's a journey. And what happens to the people on that journey, and the amazing outcome that, having been reduced to 7 followers desperately clinging on, we next meet them at Chester Street, and they've been given this enormous chunk of land by the Danish king under serious instructions from St. Cuthbert. So it's a great story, and it was fun to write.
It's another which place very strongly. One of the most vivid bits of the book that stays in the mind for me is when they first got to the disused Roman fort at Chester Street, and you imagined what that felt like to them. The Anglo-Saxons are famous for not having, they haven't had no history of building in stone. It was only after the conversion that they invited people from France to teach them how to build in stone. And they were very wary, as their poetry suggests, about the ruins that were left from the Roman past. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you tried to put yourself in their shoes as they got to this very big space where they needed to make somewhere where they could shelter for themselves?
Oh, yeah. I think the Roman past, it's very fascinating in that period, that found themselves in the remains of a very different civilization. Are we having a little something? I'm sorry, I'm just having a little interruption there. No, not from you. Yes, so in fact, they would have been familiar at Carlisle, because there was a Roman fort at Carlisle. So it wasn't a complete precedent, but nevertheless, it was very fascinating to imagine them moving into the ruins. And the new church of St. Cuthbert was built on the stone foundations of the commandant's house, essentially, in Chester Street, because it was functional as well, because it could be defended. And although they had got onto terms with the Danes, they were still vulnerable. And I'm sure those walls felt quite comfortable.
We're about to move on to talk about the your final volume, A New Heaven and a New Earth. And somebody's asked a question about a later period, but I think we might just dwell on the 3rd volume of the trilogy before I turn to Angus's very interesting question. The final volume is the longest of the 3, and the one where I think, if it's fair, that you felt the most confident about developing the personalities of the people that you're talking about. It's a very interesting story where it's situated immediately after the Norman conquest, in the period of William the Conqueror's harrying of the north. The communities in Durham and suddenly find itself extremely vulnerable. One of the most interesting ways about the way you weave that story together, is that you tell this through 3 different narrators involved in different ways in the story, and they're all first person. And at no point when you shift do you give us any clues. So we have to work out who's talking now. Why did you decide to set it up like that? And did you have fun playing with it?
Well, I certainly did, yes. I had, it wasn't too confusing. So, I think the first point to make is they're all real people, the three characters. And once again, I've depended on Simeon, who talks about all three of them in his history. And they were at the heart of what happened to the Cuthbert community during that very traumatic episode. So the three characters, there's Edith, who was ultimately discarded wife of the dean of the community. There's Aldwyn, who was a visionary monk who single-handedly started a revival of monasticism in the north after reading Bede's Life of Cuthbert. So you get an extraordinary interplay between different centuries there. And Thorgert, who was an intrepid adventurer who somehow ended up overseeing the building of Durham Cathedral. And between the three of them, their lives demonstrate something unexpected, really, about the period. It's often assumed that the Normans moved into Durham and took over the cult, and that was it. But I think the stories of Edith and Aldwyn and Thorgert demonstrate a more nuanced understanding of what happened at that time, where there was terrible destruction and suffering, but also renewal.
Angus has asked whether you could be induced to write about the end of the Durham monastery. That there are these very colourful stories in the rites of Durham at a very dramatic time for the Durham church and people. Might you be persuadable into that era?
There is a wonderful book written about it already, which put me off. I mean, so it's not a novel, but it's what's his name? I just senior moment can't remember the author. No, but there is a very wonderful account of the dissolution, actually, of the Cuthbert community. They, in fact, suffered less than other places, and they didn't actually manage to destroy St Cuthbert's body, despite their best efforts. But yes, it's a very dramatic, but I feel it has been very well done already.
I wonder if you'd like to read us a bit from the first novel. I think you chose a passage from the time when Cuthbert was on Farne.
Yes, this is a sort of classic Cuthbert on the Isle of Farne extract. At this point in the novel, Cuthbert's been in a farm for several years, which is an extraordinary act of asceticism, if you've ever been to in a farm. And he's expecting a visit. Well, he's not expecting a visitor, but he's about to get one. Cuthbert was in the garden, pulling up peahorn and stripping off the last of the peas, now hard and wrinkled in their pods, a good crop that would see him through the winter. He tossed the pods into a basket and piled up the browning home. It'd be useful for a fire or two. The soil was becoming more friable after a couple of years of cultivation. It had been difficult to work. Underneath the top layer of spongy peat, there was clay, heavy and unyielding. He had dug in seaweed over last winter. The kale was growing strongly, shiny green in the autumn sunlight. And the onions sat fat and brown, half out of the soil and ready for harvesting. He gave thanks to God for his bounty. He was rich in time now. The building work was done, and he had only to work his crops. He told time by the rhythm of the island. The movement of the tides and moon were his calendar, as familiar now as his own pulse, even when the skies were clouded He knew the measure of the day. Against the days and seasons, he set the counter rhythm of the offices, rising in the night and the pre-dawn, and marking morning, forenoon, afternoon, evening. He had been a monk for a quarter of a century or more, and he no longer had need of timetables or books. He knew the New Testament by heart and most of the Old, and the Psalms, many hymns and prayers. When he had completed an office, he continued, sometimes for hours, in contemplation of the Gospels and Christ's life, or calling on Christ's name directly. The cool darkness of the oratory was the grave of his senses. He knelt hour after hour on the hard ground before the altar, where the cross gleamed before him like a lodestar in the night. He had neither hearth nor fire in the oratory. In winter, the winds pierced every crack between the stones till his knees were frozen to the ground and his fingers refused to tell the beads. If he were fasting, he hardly had strength to pull himself upright, and he had to clutch the door frame till the blood returned to his stiffened limbs. When he went out from the oratory into the island, the light dazzled him. The vastness of the sky and ocean stretched away into immensity, beyond the tiny scrap of land that was his habitation, his small foothold on the earthly world, half drowned at the doors of the heaven. Sometimes he was besieged by phantoms, slender, laughing women at the door of his hermitage, lifting cups so close to his lips he could smell the honeyed fragrance of the mead. Half-drowned sailors clinging to the rocks who beckoned him into the ocean. Crawling demons who clutched at his habit when he went to draw water. Memories assailed him too, so vivid that they seemed real. Wilfrid, magnificent in his cope, luring him back to the world with power and office. Elfrid, a pigtailed little girl again, knocking and knocking at the door. Aniel, radiant as an angel, her smiling face turned up to him in a cloud of red gold hair. Sometimes tears ran down his face or cries broke from him. He paid them no heed. He knew he was assailed, knew he suffered, but he did not regard it. His gaze was single. He felt other currents too, not phantoms, but reverberations of the mortal world. Sometimes the sight took him, and he saw present or future things as if in a waking dream. Sometimes it was no more than a dread, an apprehension. 2 months since, a comet had appeared in the sky. It rose not at night, but at dawn. It had a fiery tail, like a column of fire. It filled him with foreboding. In its fiery magnificence, it made him think of Wilfrid. This autumn morning, with sunshine gleaming through the clouds, he felt expectation. Perhaps it was the movement of the season. He looked upwards. The first skeins of geese were starting to fly south across the island, their straggling formations like smoke among the cloud. The island was turning towards winter. As he turned back to his work, a movement on the sea caught his eye, a boat setting off from Lindisfarne. He watched for a few moments, the boat no more than a faraway smudge on the sea's face. He gathered up his basket and tools and set off back to the hermitage to stow them in the store. Then he went down to the guest house to make ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That very vividly paints what the life was like for Cuthbert and that sense of his close connection with the soil that he's tending. But also, as you reminded us at the end, one can Bede dwells a great deal on Cuthbert's solitariness, the building of a cell with walls so high that he could only see the sky. But yet, actually, you could see who was setting off from Lindisfarne, and you can see Bamborough and the royal court. So he's isolated in the middle of Northumbrian high politics.
Absolutely, yes. It's a very ambivalent choice, really, or ambiguous choice, yeah.
We've been asked if we would go back and say a little bit more about the extent to which Cuthbert might be thought to speak as a saint for all of the English. And Paul has asked, how much does the Cuthbert story speak in the south? And I think in Wessex quite a lot, but I don't know if you'd like to talk about that.
Well, I think, let's say that all saints are universal. No saint is bound by time or place. And I think the qualities that Cuthbert brought to his people of compassion and forgiveness and reconciliation are universal saintly qualities that really apply anywhere. But it is nevertheless true, I think, that there is a kind of affection in the north, an identification with Cuthbert. I have to say I have a personal there are two figures for me in the north. One, of course, is Cuthbert, and the other is Anthony Gormley's Angel of the North, which stands beside the M1 as you come into Newcastle. And there's something about both presences in the north that express a kind of vitality and resilience and a particular kind of spirituality. So I think I see Cuthbert as the ancient and the Angel of the North as the modern. Expressing something very particular about the north and its character. But we certainly would not want to cut off the south from the scent. Well, encourage you southerners to come and visit.
I think it is striking that those kings who ruled in southern England, who took over direct political hegemony in the north from a southern base, all of them do look to and visit the cult of Cuthbert. So Alfred, who first rules West Saxons and Mercian peoples together, is reputed in legend to have had this vision of Cuthbert before his major decisive battle against the Danes. When Athelstan, the first West Saxon king to rule north of the Humber, when he was on his way to Scotland, he stopped off at Chester Street to visit the Cuthbert shrine and demanded that they opened the coffin for him. And then both the 11th century conquerors of England, Canute and William the Conqueror, both came to Durham and paid their respects to the shrine, and both were major beneficiaries. So there is a sense in which Cuthbert could be harnessed to a wider sense of Englishness and made to be important for kings in the south as well as people who lived in the north. But I do think you're right that the particularity of Cuthbert's Northumbrianness is important. Angus,
maybe it's something also. I'll just say something about that. That maybe it tells us something about how power has shifted from north to south. You know, because Northumbria really was the centre of the action, and under the Danish kings, you know, the north was the important place. So the northern saint was important, but as that shifted, maybe that emphasis was lost. And then, of course, Thomas a Becket came and upstaged.
So we do know that Athelstan, the first king of all England, had an interest in the cult and gave to the community that famous manuscript now in Cambridge of Bede's two lives of the saints, the verse and the prose ones, which is accompanied in the manuscript by this fantastic image of the king handing over the book to St. Cuthbert standing outside his church with his hand raised in blessing. Lovely. So everybody combining different sorts of iconography and visual display together in a single image. Chris has asked us to what extent the Northumbrian church kept contact with Iona.
Right. Well, it was very, very closely linked to Iona initially, of course, because Aidan, who evangelized Northumbria, came from Iona. But during the period of Cuthbert's lifetime, there was a hiatus really between the Celtic and the Roman traditions, which culminated in the Synod of Whitby. Oh, Sarah, you'll be better on dates than me. 664.
664.
So the Synod of Whitby legislated really for the Roman Church, and it wasn't just a matter of the timing of Easter and the tonsure and the rest of it. It was actually a matter of church governance as well, because at that point Iona had been responsible for the appointment of bishops and essentially for the running of the Northumbrian church. And from that point on, authority was handed to Rome. And the then bishop of Lindisfarne was so disgusted that he upped and left and went back to Iona. So unfortunately, the direct influence of Iona was lost at that point. But I think it's true to say that in many ways, Cuthbert represents a marriage of the traditions. And I think it certainly looks like that to Bede, because Bede loves the things about Cuthbert, his asceticism, his closeness to the people, that can be thought of as characteristically Celtic or Ionian. So it wasn't lost, the contact with Iona, I think.
No, and the intellectual connections between the two communities do continue a long time after Lindisfarne accepted the Roman Easter and after Cuthbert had joined the community. One of the interesting things about the earliest life of Cuthbert, which we haven't really talked about at all, the anonymous life, written a very short time after the body had first been exhumed and found to be incorrupt in 698, just 11 years after his death. The life that monk of Lindisfarne, who'd clearly known Cuthbert, wrote, and the life that's written of the first abbot of Iona, St. Columba, by Addofnan. There's quite a lot of crossover between those lives, as if there is some direct intellectual and spiritual tie between the two communities.
Yeah,
long
really
after the Irish monks had gone off in a huff, though.
Yes.
And of course, Cuthbert didn't go to Lindisfarne until after 664. We don't quite know when he went, but he went clearly in order to say, we're going to do this the Roman way now. And
that's right.
I've always wondered, trying to read between the lines in the text, I've always wondered just how easy a person Cuthbert was to get on with. I think some of his contemporaries might have found him in some ways quite difficult. He was certainly very strict about how he thought things ought to happen.
Yeah, I think he was uncompromising, but Bede does say that he was a very pleasant, affable man. I prefer to go with the pleasant and affable, I think. But yes, I'm sure he was quite uncompromising and pretty irritating too, with his relentless asceticism if you wanted to stay in bed.
Yes, and all this standing up to his neck in the sea at night praying, that's a bit disturbing to those brothers who quite want to go to bed between the two night offices.
Yes.
We've been asked a question about how we think Cuthbert might speak to us today. What are the different aspects of Cuthbert's cult that are particularly relevant to us today? And the question is extremely wide-ranging, and I don't think in the small time we've got available that you can deal with all of this. But would you like to think about environmental issues and climate crisis?
Yeah, well, you probably know about St. Cuthbert and the eider duck. Do you know about St. Cuthbert and the eider duck?
Tell us about St. Cuthbert and the eider duck.
He is taken as the patron saint of environmentalism because he was the very first person in the 7th century to issue a protection order for eider duck. What was happening when he was in a farm? If you go to a farm, you'll see that there are still masses of eider who come ashore to nest during that time, and they're really quite defenseless. And the medieval fishermen were seizing the opportunity to go and wring their necks and take their eggs. And Cuthbert hated to see it, and he asked the king, would he please ban any killing of eider duck during the breeding season. So he's and the ducks are still called Cuddy's ducks. You do hear fishermen call them Cuddy's ducks, Cuddy being a corruption of Cuthbert. So I think we can, there is that environmental aspect, certainly, to Cuthbert's spirituality.
And what about how that spirituality may speak more widely to a 21st century church? How valuable are the saints of this very distant era of use to the church today?
I think in some ways there is a difference. I think there are not many people who would go into an 8-year retreat in a farm in a hut made of stones. That appears, daunting and distant. But I think perhaps harking back to what Francis is saying about time and eternity, I don't think the saints exist in time, really. I don't think there is a gap. I think what's always really struck me about Cuthbert is the extraordinary continuity in time, that we still have these relics, these objects, this life. We know so much about someone from so long ago that he seems very immediate, I think, because what a saint is not, there's not a sell-by date for it, really. So I think he speaks to us, and it's quite clear, it's very interesting that the popularity of his shrine at Durham is growing all the time, that there is a quality in his presence that I think is for everybody to discover for themselves, really. But there is that quality that speaks to people. And I might put in a little plug, actually, that a wonderful way to, I think, explore that quality is the pilgrimage routes. There's St Cuthbert's Way, and there are pilgrimage routes associated with Durham now. And travelling through the landscape is a lovely way, I think, to explore that connection with St Cuthbert.
Where does the pilgrimage route begin?
Why?
Where does it start?
It starts in Melrose. Melrose, during St Cuthbert's lifetime, was part of Northumbria. It's in the Scottish borders now. And his first monastery was there. We think of Cuthbert as Lindisfarne and Durham, but actually Melrose was really where he spent a lot of his time, did his evangelical journeys. And it's a absolutely beautiful spot. The place where his old Melrose, where his monastery was. So it starts there. Yeah, sorry.
And did you feel that was a place where you also encountered Cuthbert?
I think it's a place of real presence, yes. I mean, just a warning for listeners that you do need a special permission to visit it. It's on private land. But if you can, I think it's very beautiful. I mean, they chose the most beautiful places, and it's completely pristine as well. So it's very easy to be there.
And I think taking a pilgrimage route and walking through a landscape where the living Cuthbert also walked is in many ways a good way to get close to him and to get close to nature and to feel the silence and the potential for prayerfulness in that space where he and many other men and women in the Northumbrian church of the 7th century also encountered God and felt so passionate about what they had encountered that they wanted to go and share that good news with a population to whom he was a stranger. Thank you so much, Katharine Tiernan, for talking to us about your novels. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'm delighted to have met you and greatly enjoyed reading them. They are, of course, available from the Church Times bookshop for people who haven't yet encountered them to go and find for themselves.